It was a cold evening in Vienna, the kind that made people walk faster and tuck their hands deep into their coats. Inside the grand old conservatory, the smell of polished wood and faint echoes of music filled the hallways. Students hurried up and down the stairs carrying sheet music, violin cases, and steaming cups of coffee. Among them walked a young man named Ethan Miller, a pianist who believed he was born to stand above the rest. His confidence was not quiet. It showed in the way he walked, the way he talked, and even in the way he sat at the piano. He had a habit of tapping his fingers against any surface as if every table was a keyboard meant only for him. Ethan had spent years building a name for himself. His professors said he had perfect control, and his classmates agreed that no one could play as fast or as loud. But there was one thing that bothered him. Despite all his skill, he was rarely moved by his own music. He could impress people, but he couldn't make them feel something real. He told himself that emotion was secondary, that technique was what truly mattered. That night, an informal recital was taking place in the main hall. It was a chance for students to show their progress and play whatever piece they liked. Ethan had chosen a demanding Rachmaninoff prelude, full of heavy chords and dramatic turns. He practiced it all afternoon, striking every note with force, determined to leave no mistake behind. When he entered the hall, it was already full. The grand piano stood under a soft golden light, surrounded by rows of chairs. The audience was a mix of students, professors, and guests. The air was alive with chatter, laughter, and the sound of tuning instruments. Ethan sat down near the front, his arms crossed, waiting for his turn. On stage, a few performers came and went. Some played violin, others sang. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed until the announcer mentioned a new name, Aiko Tanaka, a pianist from Japan who had recently joined the conservatory. Ethan frowned slightly. He had heard her name before. People whispered that she had an unusual way of playing, that her music wasn't about perfection but about feeling. He had even heard one professor describe her as a poet of the piano. That phrase had annoyed him. In his view, a pianist was not a poet. A pianist was a craftsman, someone who conquered the instrument, not one who whispered to it. Aiko stepped onto the stage quietly, almost shyly. She bowed politely, adjusted the piano bench, and sat down. Her fingers rested on the keys, light as feathers. For a moment, she didn't move at all. Then she began to play. Her melody was soft, simple, and almost fragile, like a memory that might fade if you breathed too loudly. The notes drifted gently through the hall and the audience grew still. Ethan found himself watching her hands. They moved gracefully, without effort, as if she was telling a secret only the piano could understand. When she finished, there was silence. Then applause, longer than any that night. Some students even stood up. Ethan clapped too, but his hands felt heavy. He didn't like that feeling. Something about her music had touched a part of him he didn't want to admit was there. After the recital, groups of students gathered in the lobby discussing the performances. Ethan stood with a few of his friends near the piano room. He could hear them talking about Aiko, praising her playing. "She doesn't even try to impress," one said. "It's just beautiful." "Yeah," another replied. "You can feel what she's saying through the notes." Ethan smirked, trying to hide his discomfort. "Beautiful, sure, but technically it was simple. You can feel things all you want, but music is about control. She just plays soft and slow, it's not that hard." One of his friends raised an eyebrow. "Maybe, but the crowd loved her more than anyone tonight." Ethan shrugged, pretending not to care. "I'd like to see her handle a real challenge, something that actually requires skill." At that moment, Aiko herself walked past them, carrying her sheet music. She gave a polite smile as she passed, but Ethan couldn't resist saying, "Hey, Aiko, that was nice. But tell me, have you ever played something more demanding? Maybe something that tests speed and power?" Aiko stopped, a little surprised by his tone. "Music is not a test," she said softly. "It is a way to speak." The simplicity of her answer made a few people chuckle. Ethan laughed too, but there was a sharpness in it. "Well, maybe we should let the audience decide which way speaks louder. What do you say? A little piano duel? You play your way, I'll play mine." The group around them reacted with surprise. Some laughed nervously. Aiko blinked, unsure if he was serious. But Ethan was already smiling confidently, enjoying the attention. "I mean it," he continued. "Tomorrow evening, same hall. Let's see who moves the crowd more. No judges, just the music." Aiko hesitated. "I don't compete with music," she said gently. "That's fine," Ethan replied with a grin. "Then consider it a conversation between two pianists." There was a pause. She looked at him, her expression calm but unreadable. Then she nodded once. "All right, a conversation then." And just like that, it was settled. By the next morning, word had spread through the conservatory like wildfire. "Did you hear? Ethan challenged the new Japanese pianist to a duel." Students whispered it in hallways and cafeterias. Some were excited, others thought it was childish. But everyone planned to watch. Ethan spent the entire day practicing. His dorm room echoed with the thunder of piano keys. He rehearsed Rachmaninoff again, polishing every difficult passage until his hands ached. He wanted to make sure there was no weakness in his performance. His pride was on the line, and he couldn't afford to lose to someone who played lullabies. As evening approached, he dressed neatly and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw confidence, strength, and determination staring back. Yet somewhere deep inside, he felt a strange unease. He pushed it aside and told himself it was just nerves. When he arrived at the hall, it was already full again. Students filled every seat. Some even stood along the walls. The air buzzed with excitement. A few professors had come too, curious to see what would happen. On stage, the same grand piano waited under the warm lights, its polished surface gleaming like black glass. Aiko was already there, sitting quietly in the corner, her sheet music resting on her lap. She looked calm, almost peaceful, as if none of the attention bothered her. Ethan, on the other hand, could feel the adrenaline rushing through him. He loved the stage. He loved the feeling of eyes watching him, expecting something great. The announcer gave a short introduction and invited Ethan to start. He walked up with confidence, nodded to the crowd, and took his seat. For a moment, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his fingers hover over the keys. Then he began. The first notes exploded like thunder. The hall filled with powerful sound, deep bass, sharp treble, strong rhythm. His fingers flew across the keyboard, striking with precision and speed. The audience leaned forward, some nodding in admiration. He poured every ounce of skill into the piece, every trill, every octave, every dynamic change. By the time he reached the end, he lifted his hands dramatically, letting the final chord echo through the hall. The crowd applauded loudly. Ethan stood, bowed, and flashed a small, satisfied smile toward Aiko. Now it was her turn. She walked slowly to the piano, her steps light. She didn't carry any sheet music this time. She simply sat, adjusted the bench, and rested her hands on the keys. The hall went quiet again. Even the air seemed to wait. Aiko took a breath and began to play. The first few notes were soft, barely louder than a whisper. They floated gently, like a voice speaking from far away. The melody was simple, but it carried something that no one could name, a kind of sadness mixed with warmth. As she played, her expression changed slightly, as if she were remembering something personal, something only she could see. Ethan watched her from the side. At first, he thought it was too slow, too plain, but soon he noticed the faces in the audience. People weren't just listening. They were feeling. A few closed their eyes. One woman wiped away a tear. Aiko's hands moved slowly, carefully, shaping each note with tenderness. Her melody seemed to speak of memories, of someone lost, of quiet love that never fades. The longer she played, the heavier Ethan's chest felt. He didn't understand why. He had heard countless pianists before, yet none had ever made him feel like this. When the final note came, it lingered in the air for a long moment. Then silence. No one dared to clap at first. It felt wrong to break the spell. Finally, applause rose, not loud and wild, but long and heartfelt. Ethan stood still, staring at her. His earlier confidence had vanished. For the first time, he didn't know what to say or how to feel. He realized something he didn't want to admit. His music had shown skill, but hers had shown a soul. Aiko stood, bowed humbly, and smiled gently in his direction. Ethan managed a nod. The audience kept applauding, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was no rivalry in hers, only kindness. As she walked off the stage, Ethan remained frozen, his hands trembling slightly. The duel had ended, but the sound of her melody stayed in his mind, echoing long after the piano went silent. That night, as he left the conservatory and stepped into the cold Vienna air, the streets were quiet except for the distant sound of church bells. He walked slowly, his thoughts heavy and confused. For the first time, he felt the weight of humility pressing against his pride. He had challenged her, thinking he would prove his greatness. But somewhere between her first and last note, something inside him had changed. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew that he would never play the piano the same way again. The morning after the piano duel, the entire conservatory buzzed with talk. The echo of Aiko's melody still floated in everyone's mind. Even those who hadn't been there the night before had already heard about it. The story spread fast, how a quiet pianist from Japan played something so emotional that even the confident Ethan Miller was left speechless. Ethan walked through the hallways, pretending not to hear the whispers, though he caught bits and pieces. She was incredible. Did you see his face afterward? I think she made him cry inside. He tried to shrug it off. He told himself people loved gossip. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't gossip. It was truth. Aiko's music had touched people in a way his hadn't. And that truth stung. He went straight to the practice room and shut the door. The soundproof walls welcomed him with silence. Sitting at the piano, he pressed a few keys, but the notes sounded hollow. His fingers were fast, yes, but something inside him was missing. For hours he practiced, trying to chase the same feeling Aiko had created. Yet no matter how many times he played, the piano stayed cold. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "What did she do that I didn't?" he whispered. Later that day, as he was leaving the practice room, he found one of his professors, Mr. Richter, walking by. The professor was an older man with sharp eyes but a kind expression. He had seen the duel the night before and stopped when he noticed Ethan. "You played well yesterday," Mr. Richter said calmly. "Your control was perfect." Every note in its place, Ethan managed a small smile. "Thank you, sir." The professor studied him for a moment before adding, "But tell me, did you feel anything while you played?" Ethan frowned. "I was focused on doing it right." "Isn't that what matters?" Mr. Richter shook his head gently. "Technique is important, yes. But music is not mathematics, Ethan. It's a language of emotion. The audience doesn't remember your fingers. They remember your heart." He patted Ethan's shoulder and walked away, leaving those words behind like a quiet lesson. That evening, Ethan found himself wandering through the courtyard outside the conservatory. The sun had set and the lamps glowed softly against the old stone walls. He could hear faint piano notes from a nearby room. He followed the sound and found Aiko sitting alone inside, playing again. This time a slow, gentle piece that seemed to breathe. She noticed him at the door but didn't stop. She continued playing until the song ended, then looked up and smiled. "You came to listen?" Ethan hesitated. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," she said. "The piano doesn't mind company." He stepped closer. "You play differently than anyone I've met. When you play, it's like—" He struggled to find the words. "Like the piano becomes alive." Aiko laughed softly. "It's not the piano. It's what you give to it," Ethan frowned. "But how do you do that?" "I've practiced all my life. I can play the hardest pieces, but when you play, people feel something real." "What's your secret?" She looked down at the keys, thinking for a moment. "When I was a child," she began quietly, "my mother used to sing me a lullaby every night. She played the same melody on a small old piano. It wasn't perfect, but it made me feel safe. After she passed away, I kept hearing that melody in my mind. Every time I play, I try to bring that memory back." She glanced at him. "Maybe you're trying too hard to impress. Music doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be true." Her words struck him deeper than she knew. For a moment, Ethan didn't reply. He simply watched her hands resting gently on the piano, hands that created beauty without force. He realized then that his way of playing, fast, loud, flawless, had been about showing off, not sharing. "Would you teach me?" he asked softly. Aiko tilted her head, surprised. "Teach you?" "Not lessons," he said quickly. "I mean, show me how to play like you do. How to play from the heart." She smiled warmly. "Then come tomorrow. Early morning. I'll be in this room." Ethan nodded, grateful, and left the room with a strange mix of humility and hope stirring inside him. The next morning, when he arrived, Aiko was already there. She had a thermos of tea beside her and greeted him with her usual calm smile. "Good morning," she said. "Are you ready to listen more than you play?" He laughed lightly. "I'll try." She asked him to sit beside her on the bench. "Close your eyes," she said. "Don't think about the notes. Just listen." She began to play a few simple chords. "What do you feel when you hear this?" Ethan kept his eyes shut. "It sounds peaceful." Like early morning before the city wakes up. She nodded. Good, now play something that feels like that. He placed his hands on the keys and played a few soft notes. His movements were unsure at first, but Aiko didn't stop him. She listened quietly, then said, Don't force it. Let it speak slowly. Like you're having a quiet conversation with yourself. They spent the morning that way, playing, listening, sharing thoughts about sounds and feelings rather than technique. It was unlike any practice Ethan had ever done. By the end of the session, his fingers were tired, but his mind felt lighter. As days passed, their routine continued. Sometimes they practiced together for hours without speaking. Other times they talked about music, life, and what inspired them. Ethan learned that Aiko came from a small coastal town in Japan. She had grown up surrounded by the sound of waves and wind, and she said that nature taught her rhythm long before she knew what rhythm meant. Ethan, in turn, told her about his strict upbringing, about competitions, and how his father had pushed him to become the best. He realized as he spoke that he had spent most of his life chasing approval instead of joy. One afternoon, after a long session, Aiko turned to him and said, Do you know why people cried when I played that night? He shook his head. Because they saw themselves in the music, she said simply. They felt something familiar. Loss, love, memory. It wasn't about me. It was about them. That's what music should do. Ethan nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to understand. That evening after they finished practicing, Aiko stood up and said, You should play something now, something of your own. No Rachmaninoff, no showpieces, just play what you feel. He hesitated. I don't know what I feel. Then start there, she said. Play that feeling. Ethan sat at the piano, uncertain, and placed his hands on the keys. He began to play a quiet melody, hesitant at first. It was clumsy, uneven, but honest. It felt strange, exposing something real instead of perfect. When he finished, he looked up to see Aiko smiling. That was beautiful, she said. He laughed nervously. It wasn't even close to perfect. It was human, she replied. That's better than perfect. Her words stayed with him long after she left that night. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself excited to play, not to win, not to prove anything, but to explore something new inside himself. Over the next few weeks, the conservatory prepared for its annual concert, a large event where students performed before guests, critics, and visiting musicians. Everyone wanted to be part of it, especially Ethan. This time, though, he didn't want to play a thunderous, complicated piece. He wanted to do something different, something true. He told Aiko about it one morning as they practiced. I want to perform something new at the concert, not to show off. I want people to feel something real. Aiko looked pleased. Then write something from your heart. I'll help you. They began working together on a duet, a piece that blended both their styles. His strong, powerful chords and her gentle, emotional melodies intertwined like two voices learning to understand each other. Every day the music grew deeper, fuller. It wasn't about competition anymore. It was about connection. One afternoon, as they finished rehearsing, Ethan turned to her and said, You know, I used to think you were my rival. Aiko smiled softly. And now? Now I think you're my teacher, he admitted. She shook her head. No, Ethan, you're just remembering who you are. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept hearing her melody in his mind, the same one she had played at the duel. He realized that he no longer felt jealousy when he thought of it. Instead, he felt gratitude. That melody had changed him. The day of the concert arrived with the sound of rain tapping on the windows. The auditorium was filled with guests, and the stage lights glowed warmly against the dark curtains. Ethan and Aiko waited backstage, their sheet music ready. As they stepped out together, the audience grew quiet. Ethan looked at her and gave a small nod. She nodded back. Then they began to play. The opening notes were soft, familiar, the same melody Aiko had played weeks ago, but soon Ethan's deeper chords joined in, giving it new strength. The music rose and fell like two stories merging into one. Every note carried emotion, and this time Ethan felt every bit of it. He wasn't performing for approval. He was speaking honestly through sound. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause. Ethan looked at Aiko, smiling, breathless. She smiled back, and in that moment, he knew he had finally understood what music really was. It wasn't about power or perfection. It was about truth, and he had finally found it. The applause from the concert still echoed in Ethan's mind long after the lights went down. For the first time in his life, the sound of clapping didn't make him proud. It made him humble. It felt different this time. It wasn't for his perfection. It was for what the audience had felt. After the performance, he and Aiko stood together backstage, both silent for a moment. The tension of the concert melted away, replaced by quiet satisfaction. Aiko looked at him with a soft smile. "You played beautifully tonight," she said. He smiled back. "We played beautifully." Outside, the rain had stopped and the night air smelled fresh. The city lights of Vienna shimmered against the wet streets. The two of them walked side by side through the courtyard of the conservatory, their reflections gliding along the puddles. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence between them felt peaceful, not heavy. When they reached the fountain in the middle of the courtyard, Ethan stopped. "I want to thank you," he said, "for teaching me what I didn't even know I was missing." Aiko looked up at him. "You found it yourself," she said. "I only reminded you where to look." Ethan chuckled quietly. "Still, I used to think being the best meant playing the fastest, the loudest. Now I realize it means something completely different." "What does it mean now?" she asked. He looked at the rippling water. "It means being honest. Playing from the heart, making people feel something real." She nodded, her expression gentle. "Then you're becoming an artist." The next few weeks were peaceful. Ethan and Aiko continued to play together, sometimes in empty rooms, sometimes for small audiences of friends. Their duet from the concert became popular among the students. People would ask them to play it again, saying it brought them calm or made them remember someone they loved. But while everything seemed perfect on the surface, something deeper began to stir in Ethan's mind. He felt restless. Every time he played, he noticed something new in Aiko's expression, something quiet and far away. She played with such tenderness that it often seemed like she was saying goodbye to someone through her music. One afternoon, as they practiced in the small piano room filled with sunlight, he finally asked, "Aiko, why do your melodies always sound a little sad?" She paused, her fingers resting on the keys. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she said softly, "Because they come from memories." "Bad memories?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Not bad, just memories that don't come back." Ethan waited, sensing there was more. She looked out the window, where the leaves were turning golden in the early autumn breeze. "My mother used to play with me when I was little," she said. "After she died, I stopped playing for a long time. Then one day I sat at the piano again and it felt like she was there. That's when I understood music can bring people back, even if only for a few minutes." Ethan didn't know what to say. He could see that the memory was both painful and precious to her. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. Aiko smiled faintly. "It's why I never stopped. Every time I play, I remember her." He nodded slowly, feeling something tighten in his chest. He realized that while he had been learning to feel through music, Aiko had been living it all along. For her, the piano wasn't just an instrument, it was a bridge between her past and the present. That evening, as Ethan walked home, he thought about his own life. He had spent years chasing recognition, competitions, and trophies. He couldn't even remember why he had started playing in the first place. But that night, for the first time, he tried to remember the small things. His first piano lesson, the look of pride on his mother's face when he played his first song, the warmth of family evenings long before his dreams became heavy with pressure. The next morning, he came to practice early. Aiko wasn't there yet. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a small clock on the wall. Ethan sat at the piano and began to play something soft and uncertain. It wasn't one of his usual pieces. It was something new, something he hadn't written down. When Aiko arrived, she stood by the door listening. He didn't notice her until the melody faded. "That was lovely," she said. Ethan turned, startled. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in." She walked closer. "That song, you wrote it?" He nodded. "It's still rough, I just played what I felt," she smiled. "That's how the best music begins." He hesitated for a moment. "Aiko, I've been thinking. What if we record our duet? Share it online? Maybe it could reach more people." Aiko looked surprised but thoughtful. "You think people would listen?" "I know they would," Ethan said. "It's not just a song anymore. It's something people can feel. And I want to share that feeling with others." She considered it for a moment and then nodded. All right, let's do it. Over the next few days, they practiced carefully, making small adjustments to their performance. Ethan wanted everything to sound perfect, but Aiko reminded him gently, perfection isn't what people need. They need sincerity. They recorded the piece in a small studio near the conservatory. The room was quiet, with microphones placed carefully around the piano. When they started playing, everything else faded away. The ticking clock, the sound of cars outside, even their own breathing. It was just the two of them and the music. When the final note faded, the room was filled with stillness. The technician turned to them and said quietly, "That was beautiful." They uploaded the recording that night. Within days, it began spreading online. People left comments saying the music made them cry, that it reminded them of their loved ones, that it gave them peace. Ethan read each comment carefully, feeling something inside him heal a little more with every message. But one morning, when he arrived at the conservatory, Aiko wasn't there. Her piano bench was empty. On the keyboard lay a small folded note. He picked it up, his heart suddenly uneasy. The note read, "Thank you for the music, Ethan. I have to return home for a while. There are things I need to take care of. Don't worry, I'll be back when the season changes." He read it twice, then 3 times. He felt a mix of confusion and sadness. He wanted to ask why, to tell her not to go, but she was already gone. Days turned into weeks. The first snow arrived, covering Vienna in white. Ethan continued to play their duet at small gatherings, always introducing it as a song about remembering. The audience loved it, but each time he played, he felt her absence beside him like a missing heartbeat. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit at the same piano room where they had practiced and imagine her there. He would play softly, pretending she was listening. He didn't know when she would return, but he believed she would. One evening, after finishing a small recital, he stepped outside into the quiet snow. A light wind brushed against his face. He closed his eyes and thought of Aiko's melody, the one she had played the night of the duel. It echoed in his mind, gentle and full of life. In that moment, he realized something profound. The reason her music touched so many people wasn't only because it was emotional. It was because it carried love. Pure, unguarded love for everything she had lost and everything she still hoped to keep. Ethan went home and sat at his piano. For hours he played and wrote, letting his feelings pour out through the keys. He wasn't sure what he was creating, but it felt honest. It felt alive. By the time the first light of morning touched the curtains, a new melody was born, a piece he would later call The Return. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted and the city began to bloom again. One afternoon, as Ethan walked through the courtyard, he heard a familiar sound, the soft, careful notes of a piano. He followed them to the same room where it had all begun. There she was. Aiko sat at the piano, her eyes closed, playing the same gentle tune she had played the night of the duel. He stood at the door for a moment, not wanting to break the moment. When she finished, she turned and smiled. "I told you I'd come back when the season changed." Ethan laughed softly, relief washing over him. "You always keep your promises." She nodded toward the piano. "Play with me?" He sat beside her, and together they played The Return. Their hands moved in harmony, his firm chords supporting her tender melody. The room filled with warmth, sunlight spilling through the windows. When the last note faded, Aiko looked at him and said, "You've found your own voice now." He smiled, a little shyly. "You helped me find it." She shook her head gently. "You just needed someone to remind you where to listen." And for the first time, Ethan understood what she truly meant. Music wasn't about sound. It was about connection, about remembering who we are and what we love. Outside, the bells of Vienna began to ring softly in the distance. The two pianists sat quietly for a moment, surrounded by the echo of their shared melody, a melody born from a duel, shaped by friendship and carried by the simple, human need to feel and be felt. Ethan smiled at Aiko and whispered, "I'm glad you played that melody that night." She smiled back. "So am I." The spring air in Vienna was full of new life. The trees outside the conservatory had begun to bloom, and the streets glowed softly with golden light. For Ethan and Aiko, life felt peaceful again. Their days were filled with music, laughter, and quiet understanding. After months of uncertainty, things finally seemed to have found balance. Every morning they met at the same piano room. Sometimes they practiced for hours. Sometimes they just played for fun, exploring new melodies together. Their fingers moved in harmony, their timing so natural that it almost felt like the piano itself had learned to breathe with them. Ethan had changed. The proud, sharp-edged pianist who once believed in nothing but perfection was gone. He no longer played to impress. He played to connect. His music had softened, gained warmth, and each note carried a part of his heart. The students at the conservatory noticed the change too. "Ethan's playing sounds different," they whispered. "It feels real now." He no longer minded the whispers. He had nothing to prove. He had already won something far more valuable than any competition. He had found meaning in his art. One afternoon, after finishing their rehearsal, Aiko turned to him with a small smile. "Do you remember the first time you challenged me?" Ethan laughed quietly. "I was such an arrogant fool," she giggled softly. "You were confident. Overconfident," he corrected, still smiling. "If I could go back, I'd take it back." "I didn't know who I was challenging," Aiko tilted her head. "Maybe that's how it had to happen. If you hadn't challenged me, we might never have played together." He thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. Maybe it was fate." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the sunlight falling gently across the keys. Then Aiko said quietly, "I want to tell you something." Ethan turned to her, sensing a shift in her tone. "I came back to Vienna," she began, "because I wanted to finish something. When I left Japan, I promised myself I would play my mother's melody on every stage I could. But after our concert, I realized, I'm not done yet." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I got a letter," she said softly, "from a music foundation in Kyoto. They want me to perform there next month. It's a tribute concert for teachers and artists who inspired others. My mother used to play there when she was young. They want me to play her melody again." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's amazing." "You have to go," she smiled gently. "I will, but I wanted to tell you first." He felt a small ache in his chest. The thought of her leaving again made something inside him tighten. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly. "I think so," she said after a pause, "but sometimes life doesn't tell us what's next. I'll just keep playing and see where the melody takes me." Ethan tried to smile, though his heart felt heavy. "Then I guess I'll have to wait for the next season again." Aiko laughed softly, her eyes kind. "Maybe not so long this time." Over the next few weeks, they prepared together for her performance. Ethan helped her rehearse, offering small suggestions and playing accompaniment whenever she asked. But more often, he just listened. Each time she played her mother's melody, it sounded deeper, more emotional. It carried something new, something like farewell. The day before she was set to leave, they met one last time in the piano room. The weather outside had turned gray, and rain tapped gently against the windows. Aiko placed her hands on the piano and played quietly, her melody floating softly through the air. When she finished, she looked at Ethan and said, "Will you play something for me?" He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." He began to play the piece he had written during the winter, The Return. His fingers moved slowly at first, then stronger, weaving her melody and his together like two voices in a single story. As the final notes faded, Aiko smiled. "That song," she said softly. "It's like us." He looked at her. "It is us." They didn't say much more after that. She stood, walked over, and handed him a small folded paper. "Keep this," she said. "What is it?" "It's my mother's melody," she replied. "The original one. I've never given it to anyone before." Ethan looked at the handwritten notes, his heart full. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Now it belongs to you too." He didn't know what to say. He simply nodded and held the paper carefully, as if it were something sacred. The next morning, she left for Japan. He went to the train station to see her off. The platform was crowded, the sound of announcements echoing above the chatter. Aiko stood by the door of the train, her small suitcase beside her. Ethan smiled, trying to stay calm. "Play beautifully," he said. She smiled back. "Always." When the train began to move, she leaned out the window slightly and called, "Don't stop playing, Ethan." He raised his hand and waved as the train pulled away, her voice fading into the distance. For a long time, he stood there, watching until the last carriage disappeared from view. Then he walked back through the quiet streets, her melody echoing faintly in his mind. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan kept busy with his own performances, but Every time he sat at the piano, he thought of her. He often unfolded the paper she had given him, tracing the notes with his fingers. Sometimes he would play the melody just to feel close to her again. Her absence changed the way he played. His music carried a quiet longing now, something gentle and nostalgic. The students who heard him play said his sound had become more emotional than ever before. One afternoon, as he finished a small concert, he noticed an email on his phone. It was from Aiko. It read, "The concert in Kyoto was beautiful. I played our duet as the closing piece. The audience stood for almost 5 minutes. My mother would have smiled. Thank you for giving my music a new voice. I'll send you the recording soon." Ethan smiled as he read it, feeling both joy and sadness. She had achieved something wonderful. Yet deep down he missed her presence, the way she made the room brighter, the way her music seemed to breathe. Months went by and seasons changed again. Her letters became less frequent. Sometimes she would write short notes about her travels, playing in small towns, teaching children, visiting her mother's old friends. Ethan was happy for her, but he couldn't help feeling a quiet emptiness growing inside him. One late autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the courtyard, Ethan was teaching a group of younger students when he received a package. It was from Japan. Inside was a CD, a handwritten note, and a small origami crane. The note said, "This is my last concert recording. I hope you'll listen and keep our melody alive." He placed the CD in the player and pressed play. The room filled with her music, soft, emotional, powerful. It was the same melody she had once played in Vienna, but now it carried something different. It felt like both an ending and a promise. As the music played, Ethan closed his eyes. He could almost see her sitting there, smiling softly, her hands moving gracefully across the keys. When the last note faded, he sat in silence. Something in him knew that their paths had changed forever. She was out there somewhere, following her melody to new places, and he was here, carrying her music forward. That evening, Ethan returned to the concert hall where they had once performed their duet. The hall was empty now, except for the grand piano waiting on the stage. He sat down and began to play Aiko's melody from memory. The sound filled the room, soft and haunting. Each note carried emotion, gratitude, love, loss, and hope. He played until the light outside dimmed and the world fell quiet. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you, Aiko." Then he smiled because he realized something. She wasn't really gone. Every time he played, she was there. Every time someone heard their song, a piece of her lived on. From that day, Ethan made it his mission to share her melody with the world. He performed it in concerts, recorded it for students, and even taught it in his classes. People began to call it the Whisper of Spring. They said it was a song that made them remember someone they loved. Years passed. Ethan grew older, his hair touched with gray, but his music remained as alive as ever. Whenever he played the Whisper of Spring, he could still feel her beside him. Sometimes, in the quiet after a performance, he would look up at the piano bench beside him and imagine her sitting there, smiling as she always did. And in those moments, he knew that no goodbye was ever final in music, because melodies once shared never really end. They live on, in memories, in hearts, in the spaces between notes forever. And so, every time his fingers touched the keys, Ethan whispered softly, "This one's for you." Years rolled by, and time, as it always does, moved quietly forward. The city of Vienna changed. New students filled the conservatory halls. New faces came and went, but in one corner of the building, a familiar sound always returned, the sound of music that spoke to the heart. Ethan was no longer the restless young pianist who once played to prove himself. His hair had streaks of gray now. His face had softened with age, and his voice carried the calm wisdom of someone who had lived through sound and silence alike. Yet his hands still carried the same grace, the same life, the same quiet fire. He had become one of the most respected teachers in the conservatory. Students admired him not only for his skill, but for his patience, his humility, and the way he spoke about music as if it were alive. Every year, during the spring recital, he performed one special piece, The Whisper of Spring. The melody had become legendary. New generations of students learned it, played it, and passed it on, though few knew the real story behind it. To them, it was simply a beautiful song that made the heart ache and heal at the same time. But to Ethan, it was a memory, a promise he had kept alive. One afternoon after class, a young student lingered behind. She was quiet, holding a small notebook in her hands. "Professor," she asked, "can I ask you something?" Ethan looked up from the piano and smiled. "Of course, that song you always play." "The Whisper of Spring," she said softly. "Who wrote it?" Ethan paused for a moment. The question was simple, but it carried weight. "A dear friend," he said finally. "Someone who taught me what music really means." The student hesitated. "Is she still alive?" He smiled faintly. "In the music, yes, always." She nodded quietly, not asking more. She simply bowed and left the room. Ethan sat there for a long time afterward, listening to the faint echoes of her footsteps. Then he turned back to the piano. His fingers hovered over the keys and he began to play the melody once again. The notes filled the empty room like a soft breeze. It had been decades, but each time he played it, it still felt new. Halfway through the song, a memory surfaced. That first night in the conservatory hall, when Aiko had sat down and played for the first time. The hall had gone silent and he had felt something break open inside him. That night had changed his life. He smiled to himself. "Still teaching me, aren't you?" he whispered. In the years after Aiko left, her melody had spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. A recording of her Kyoto performance had been shared among musicians around the world. It found its way into concerts, piano competitions, and even movies. People called it a song of sorrow and light, but very few knew the name behind it, Aiko Tanaka. She had never sought fame, and Ethan had never tried to claim credit. He had always believed that her melody didn't belong to one person. It belonged to everyone who felt something when they heard it. Still, every once in a while, he wondered where she was. Whether she still played. Whether she ever thought of him. He never got an answer, but he didn't need one. He had her music, and that was enough. One rainy evening, Ethan received a letter. It was from Japan. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the neat strokes reminded him of something. He opened it carefully. It read, "Dear Mr. Miller, I am writing to you from Kyoto. My name is Hana. I was one of Aiko Tanaka's students. She spoke of you often, and she wanted you to know that she always kept her promise to play her mother's melody wherever she went. She passed away peacefully last winter, surrounded by her students. Her final wish was that her music would continue to inspire others, especially you. She said you would know what to do. Thank you for being her friend." With gratitude, Hana Ethan sat there in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. The room felt still, as if even the rain outside had paused. For a long time, he didn't move. He just let the words sink in. Then very slowly he smiled, not out of joy but out of love. He whispered softly, "You kept your promise, Aiko, and I'll keep mine." That night he stayed in the music room long after everyone had gone home. He placed the letter beside the piano and began to play. At first his hands trembled, but as the melody grew, the trembling stopped. The music filled the air like a gentle voice, speaking without words. Each note carried her presence, and her laughter, her quiet strength, her kindness. When the final note faded, he closed his eyes. The silence felt full. The next morning he made a decision. He announced a new project at the conservatory, The Melody Lives On, a yearly concert dedicated to forgotten composers and musicians whose stories deserve to be told. He made sure that the first concert would be centered around the Whisper of Spring and the life of Aiko Tanaka. His students worked with excitement and curiosity. They researched her background, learned her compositions, and even prepared a small exhibit about her life. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen how much one person's emotion could shape generations. On the evening of the concert, the hall was full. Former students, professors, and even some of Aiko's pupils from Japan attended. A large portrait of her was placed near the stage with a single white flower beside it. Ethan stepped onto the stage slowly, greeted by warm applause. He took a deep breath and sat at the piano. Before playing, he spoke softly into the microphone. "Years ago," he began, "I met a woman who reminded me that music is not about winning or losing. It's about sharing what's inside the heart. She played one melody that changed my life forever. Tonight, I want to share it with all of you, not as a performance, but as a memory, as a promise kept." He looked up once more at the portrait and smiled. Then he began to play. The melody rose gently, familiar and timeless. The audience listened in complete silence. Some closed their eyes, some wept quietly. And though Aiko was gone, it felt as though she was there, her spirit moving through every note. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for a few moments before erupting into applause. People stood, clapping through tears. Ethan bowed his head, his eyes moist but full of peace. After the concert, Hannah, the student who had written to him, approached the stage. She bowed deeply and handed him a small envelope. "She wanted you to have this," she said softly. Inside was a photo, Aiko sitting at a piano, smiling brightly, surrounded by children. On the back she had written in neat handwriting, "For Ethan, thank you for giving my melody wings." He looked at the picture for a long moment, then placed it carefully in his coat pocket. "Thank you," he whispered. As the crowd slowly left the hall, Ethan remained behind. The lights dimmed and he sat once more at the piano. He didn't play the Whisper of Spring this time. Instead, he began to improvise, soft, slow, gentle, as if speaking to her through the keys. The music blended with the night outside, with the wind, with the memory of everything they had shared. When he finally stopped, he looked up at the empty seats and said softly, "Good night, Aiko." The years that followed were quiet and beautiful. Ethan continued teaching, mentoring young musicians, and sharing the lessons he had learned from her. He became known not just as a pianist, but as a storyteller, someone who used music to teach people how to feel again. In his final years, when his hands grew tired and his eyes weaker, he would sit by the window and listen to recordings of his students playing The Whisper of Spring. Each time he smiled. The melody was alive, carried forward by voices he had never met, in places he had never been. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat at his piano for the last time. The room was quiet, golden light filling the space. He placed the old photo of Aiko on the piano, touched the keys gently, and began to play one last time. The melody flowed like a memory, soft and endless. And as the final note lingered, a calm smile spread across his face. Outside, the trees swayed gently, their blossoms falling like snow, and somewhere far beyond the sound, two melodies met once again, one of a man who learned to feel, and one of a woman whose music never truly ended, because real music never fades, it only changes hands. And the whisper of spring continued to echo through time, in classrooms, in concert halls, and in every heart that ever needed to remember what love sounded like.